Let's talk about the war in Ukraine. It's been 2 years since all of this.
Специальной военной операции.
Ukraine under attack.
It was as sudden as it was brutal.
War comes suddenly, and it comes from the sky.
In days, the lives of millions upended.
Thousands dash for refuge and cling to help.
These days, the war is no longer grabbing the same kind of attention. But the fighting is still intense, even though in the last few months, the front line has hardly moved.
There is kind of a stalemate.
Both sides are dug in, both sides are stuck.
Meanwhile, Ukraine has another battle on its hands, convincing the West to keep military aid flowing.
When the free world hesitates, that's when dictatorships celebrate.
So what is going on with the war in Ukraine? And why is there this stalemate 2 years on? If you go to Kyiv these days, you might, for a moment, forget that Ukraine is at war. Because on the surface, life in the capital looks relatively normal. That's Valeria. 2 years ago, millions of people watched her TikTok videos that showed life in a bomb shelter and the destruction of her hometown, Chernihiv. Valeria left Ukraine for a while, but a few months ago, she decided to return and restart her life in Kyiv.
People are still trying to do their things, working, meet with friends, but on another side, on another part of this situation, so many people, women and men, defend our country. People dying every day. When I say that life is pretty normal now, it's not true. For example, today Kyiv was bombed. People died today in the morning when I was sleeping. I don't know when rocket can be in my house. I want to stay here, but now I know that in every moment, maybe I need to run again.
Now, while there are signs of normality in Kyiv, it's a very different picture in Ukraine's south and east. Places like Avdiivka. It's a town that's been fought over for months. Russian forces took it in mid-February. Avdiivka's here, on the front line, which is about 1,500 kilometers long. Russia controls about 18% of Ukraine. That includes Crimea and parts of the Donbass region, territory they've had since 2014. Now, last year, there was a lot of hype about Ukraine's counter-offensive. It was a big plan to push Russian forces back. Ukrainian forces made some gains, but it wasn't game-changing. And since then, the front lines barely moved. Ukraine's withdrawal from Avdiivka has been the biggest shift.
The pendulum seems to have swung constantly from one side to the other. Although the Russians were able to take significant chunks of Ukraine right at the beginning, since then it really has devolved into something of a stalemate.
A long, high-intensity trench war with hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides. Like in the First World War, something like that. No one prepared for that.
It takes a lot to sustain a war like this, let alone win it. And that helps to explain how we've reached this kind of deadlock, because both sides are struggling with weapons, ammunition, and troops. Let's start with that issue. Russia and Ukraine have suffered huge numbers of casualties, but it's hard to get accurate figures. Ukraine doesn't disclose them, and Russia is accused of underreporting. Last year, US officials estimated that Russia's total dead and injured was about 300,000. For Ukraine, they said it was around 200,000. Overall, when it comes to troop numbers, Russia has an advantage. Its population is much bigger than Ukraine's, and it has a bigger army too. The Russian military includes conscripts. Young men are required to do a year of service. The age range used to be 18 to 27, but this year, the age limit was raised to 30 to widen the pool of men they can call up. Russia's also been recruiting convicts from prisons to send to the front line.
And although numbers are not the only factor, nonetheless, mass matters.
Ukraine's new military chief has admitted this. In a post on Telegram, he said Russia's numerical advantage has been a challenge. Now, at the start of the war, the Ukrainian army expanded rapidly. Many Ukrainians signed up voluntarily, but all men between 27 to 60 can be called up, and they're banned from leaving the country. Most soldiers have now been fighting almost non-stop for 2 years. They're exhausted, and there's no official limit on how long they have to serve. It's indefinite.
Хлопці із позиції і не дуже свіжі. І зараз приходиться знаходити сили.
Бо від початку війни на передовій, і щоб нас хоча б замінив.
So right now, Ukraine is facing a big challenge with how to switch out soldiers and bring in new ones to maintain and boost troop numbers. The military said it wants about 500,000 new recruits, and the government has proposed lowering the minimum conscription age from 27 to 25. But there's a big debate around it.
On the third year of the war, it's really about the military draft, who is serving, who is not, what is just, what is not, how to involve more soldiers, how you can involve them without ruining the economy. It's difficult also because those people went through the battles, they're extremely experienced and efficient. So you don't want just to replace a very experienced soldiers.
So, both Ukraine and Russia are battling on with the troops they have. Enough to keep the fighting going, but not enough to push the other side back in a major way. So then comes the issue of weapons.
Both sides are having to some degree, ration, for example, how much artillery fire they use in a day. Both sides are suffering, but the Russians are suffering less. They have heavily militarized their economy, again, surprisingly quickly and efficiently.
Russia's also reportedly getting weapons from Iran and North Korea.
These pictures, experts say, show a Shahed 136, a drone only manufactured by Iran that is lethal, but also relatively cheap, costing about $20,000 apiece.
On the Ukrainian side, the shortage of weapons and ammunition is probably their biggest problem right now. Since the beginning of the war, they've relied heavily on supplies from the West. The US and European countries are ramping up arms production, but not fast enough to meet Ukraine's needs.
Ukraine is trying to build up its own domestic defense industry, but that takes time. And the West is really not well placed to actually continue to supply them with everything they need, simply because we let our industries and our stocks decline quite a bit.
Another aspect to the weapons issue is the types of weapons being used and how effectively each side is working with what it's got. So, for example, Russia has a much bigger air force than Ukraine. And in the early days, many people thought that alone would give Russia a decisive edge. But Ukraine mounted a pretty successful air defense, using things like shoulder-launched rockets. And since last year, it's had the Patriot missile defense system. It's made in the US, and it's really effective. But it's also really expensive. Each missile costs about $4 million.
The Russian Air Force tried to dominate, encountered heavy losses, and that means Russian Air Force is not flying into Ukrainian controlled territory.
Another way Ukraine has been able to balance out Russia's firepower is through drones, both for surveillance and to drop bombs. Ukraine is focused on developing its drone technology and production. They're doing things like adapting commercial drones, like the ones videographers use at weddings. These are cheap and accessible. Ukraine has also developed sea drones. These are much more expensive. They're basically modified jet skis that carry explosives. It says it sank this Russian ship using them.
It's a drones war. When the war started, it was just the Ukrainians who were using them. And there was a domination. The Russians caught up.
They're not quite as quick and as nimble at thinking new ideas as the Ukrainians. But nonetheless, in their own way, they had learned the rules of the sort of first year of the war and adapted to match.
The thing about Ukraine's war effort is that it relies so much on support from its allies. In the 2 years since Russia's invasion, Ukraine has been promised $277 billion of aid for financial, military, and humanitarian support, and it's received $175 billion. But whether aid will continue flowing at the same rate is in doubt. The EU had a big fight to pass a $54 billion aid package recently. And then there's everything happening in the US. A $61 billion package for Ukraine is stuck in Congress. It's part of a bigger bill that also deals with aid to Israel and immigration.
Republicans in Congress have insisted they won't authorize any more funding unless Democrats agree to stricter measures to limit migration.
This is the problem in some ways with American politics. Everything becomes a bargaining chip for something else. And at the moment we see a relative handful of Republicans who are absolutely digging in their heels and preventing the aid package from going through.
The outcome of the U.S.'s presidential election in November adds to the uncertainty for Ukraine. Because Donald Trump could win. He's been skeptical about supporting Ukraine in the past.
We're spending $170 billion for faraway land.
And his position towards Russia is also really unpredictable. So if we take things back to the battlefield, the war might look like a stalemate, but that's with Ukraine throwing everything at it. People are talking about what might happen over the next few months, especially if Western support tapers off.
In many ways, Russia has the advantage in this coming year. It's got more ammunition. It has the capacity to mobilize more soldiers. I think the Russians will, at the very least, push the Ukrainians back some way this year.
In Alice Wonderland, there was this quote that you need to run twice as fast if you want to stay on the same place. And that's what Ukrainians are doing. They are doing all the running to stay on the same place. The war really has a huge toll on this population, on the psyche, on the people, on the lives which are lost on the front line and every day. It's a very huge price. But what is the alternative?
If there's a news story or a topic you want us to explain, drop us a comment in this video and check out the Full Start Here playlist to watch our other episodes.